So thank you for joining us for another webinar. We will talk today about how will the second China shock play out with my former colleague Paul Krugman from CUNY. Hi, Paul.
Hi there.
Great to have you. And we will talk about the China shock today. So the key questions we would like to address today is what is actually the second China shock? And how will the new global trade world order, which one will emerge? And is actually globalization compatible with industrial policy? How can we connect the two things? And then I would like to ask the question, can actually the US run a permanent current account deficit and never pay back? Is this a feasibility or not? And then I will pass on the mic to Paul. So of course we had the first China shock essentially happening in the 2000s when people argued that, China exporting manufacturing goods mostly to the US is eroding the American industrial base. So China's world GDP is about 17%, but manufacturing of the world is about 29%. And it consumes only 30% of total world consumption. Or is it actually, because the industrial sector in US declined, is it more technological change? Or is it really the China shock, or is it technological change? But then we talk about the second China shock. And some people argue it's because the Chinese in recession, they will export and try to push to export even more, and that's the second China shock. From other countries' perspective, so Richard Baldwin and Sanders and Tortor and Brett Sester argued, for Germany, the second China shock is that the demand from China is breaking away. So the export towards China is actually breaking away. And there's actually, Richard Baldwin argued, there's an import substitution going on in the recent years. So actually the imports China is taking are going down drastically. And then most recently, China came up with DeepSeek, some AI software, and that's also causing a shock to the United States. And some people call that the second China shock. But I guess we will talk about the first version of the second China shock today. So if you think about the benefits of free trade, of course, there's a static comparative advantage story, but what's even more important is that over time, there's a dynamic benefit of free trade. There's a technological transfer from one country to another country or in both directions. And also what openness is often used to have a political economy benefit in the sense that you can actually push reforms through because you have to have these reforms in order to open up the economy. And that's often used, opening up the economy is used as a catalyst to push some economic reforms through. Now, if you think about, is industrial policy really compatible with globalization? So why do we have industrial policy? Often, we have increasingly industries where there are a lot of increasing returns to scale. And of course, Paul is famous for having worked on increasing returns to scale. And that's essentially, you would like to do industrial policy to take an advantage of it. If you have set up an industry, you can set also the standards down the road, and that also gives an advantage. And that might not be compatible with a setting where you have free trade and free capital flows. And that's essentially some tension one has to think about. You might also create some choke points and have some geopolitical bargaining power. If you have a certain large industry, you dominate the world economy, certain industries. But the question is, what are the costs for the deficit country like the US running a deficit? Or is it just a benefit that you have essentially cheap consumption? And there's some earlier work saying, okay, actually every job lost in the US gives the consumer in the US a benefit of $400,000. But that's, of course, a controversial number, but essentially there are also some benefits from getting some cheaper consumption and keeping inflation low. But once you have the setting that a country is doing very strong industrial policy, what should the deficit country then do? What's the response to that? And one response is you do your own industrial policy. That's like the Biden approach, Inflation Reduction Act, and that, of course, leads to some high fiscal expenses. Or the Trump approach is much more to impose tariffs to counteract the industrial policy from the other country. Now, the final question I would like to address, or saying, can actually the US run a permanent current account deficit all the time and never has to pay it back? And there is an argument to be made that actually the US can run permanently a current account deficit because it enjoys an exorbitant privilege. It can issue some bubbly safe asset. So you continuously issue more safe assets to foreigners who would like to hold a safe asset because it allows them to self-insure through retrading among themselves even. It's a benefit they're getting from that. And essentially you provide this service to issue this asset which allows others to, through retrading, to self-insure for precautionary reasons. And if this asset is public, actually, then it's actually possible that you can constantly have a current account deficit. You never really physically have to pay back in terms of having to deliver physical goods down the road or some services down the road in order to pay back the debt you went into. So in a sense, in a technical sense, the transversality condition does not hold at the country level. It still holds at the individual level from agent by agent, but at the country level, it doesn't need to hold in such a setting. So that's a paper which is alluding to that. So let me leave it at that, and then we are curious to get Paul's take on the second China shock and how it will play out, I guess, primarily in the US or in the rest of the world as well. Thanks again, Paul. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks. So everybody, and Markus, my apologies. I ended up unintentionally pulling a kind of bait and switch. I thought I was going to do second China shock, and that's certainly part of the story, but as I was getting my act together for this talk, I ended up veering off in a related but different direction, which is, partly it's a request. People have been asking me to, particularly Arvind Subramanian at Peterson has been asking me for a response to some of the new views that we've been hearing about trade imbalances. And of course, that very much relates to the China shock, and China is at the heart of a lot of this stuff. But I'm going to talk relatively less than you might expect about China, and more about this sort of new view. So with that apology. So I'm sure if we have some time for discussion that the China issues will come up as well. But this is very, I am going to be going in a somewhat different direction. So if you are following this kind of quasi-academic discussion, yes, this is at the, we have now quite a lot of buzz in sort of policy think tanks, though not exactly economics think tanks, in policy circles, of a view that says that all of the conventional rules about trade are kind of off because they presume a world of more or less balanced trade, that we have instead a world of large, persistent trade imbalances, and that these imbalances are a distortion imposed by government action. The person most associated with this, and he's endless, writes about it a lot, is Michael Pettis, who rather oddly is based in China, but anyway, and he had, this is a recent Carnegie Endowment paper that I thought summarized his views quite well, and which I think of as, it's an interesting set of ideas. I believe mostly wrong, although there's certainly some points to it, but then we do need to ask, what do we think is really true in this world of big trade imbalances? So on the next slide, I actually summarize, I think Pettis would agree that this is kind of what he's saying. I think I've had a little correspondence, and he certainly hasn't said you've outrageously misrepresented my views. And it's certainly, anyway, things that a lot of people in this kind of sort of semi-academic policy space now believe. The first is that trade is supposed to be more or less balanced. That if things were normal, countries would, as I think he says, that you export in order to import. And so you would have not maybe precisely balanced trade, but relatively balanced trade country by country, not bilateral. I don't think anybody except the President of the United States believes that trade should be balanced bilaterally, but overall, that should be the norm. That to the extent that we in fact have large trade imbalances, that's because we have government policies, particularly in the surplus countries, that are distorting trade. That these policies, by inducing these persistent trade imbalances, hurt the deficit countries, and that tariffs can be an appropriate response. So this is not Trumpian. And I have no reason to believe that the people advancing these views are Trump supporters or in support of those tariffs on Canada and Mexico that are supposedly going to be imposed by Saturday. But it's clearly more friendly towards a Trumpian point of view. Sorry, let's stay with this for a second. Than sort of the standard economic analysis. What I've been doing is trying to go through this list and say, what of this is true? And I would say that most of it is not, but there are some things. It's certainly good to raise the questions and worth talking about. We shouldn't say economic theory says everything is fine, because there are real issues here. But let's go through it. So. The idea that trade, absent distortionary government policies, would be relatively balanced is actually, in the light of history, it's not true. If we ask, when has trade been strongly unbalanced? And of course, it's the accounting identity, trade balance, strictly speaking, current account balance. But anyway, current account balance plus capital account balance equals 0. So large capital mobility, large capital flows were actually quite normal before World War I, then ceased to be normal for an extended period, and then became normal again. And so the next slide is my one, I think. No, I guess that's right. No, sorry. There's this wonderful set of historical tables put together by the Bank of England for Parliament that go in many, way back. Some of them actually go all the way back to 1066. And obviously, when we're doing economic data, there's a lot of interpolation and estimation because they didn't have national accounts back then. But one thing that you see, this is the British current account. Britain ran very large current account surpluses in the late 19th century. The age of globalization via steamships and telegraphs was very serious globalization. There was a lot of capital flow. It was typically from European countries. If you look at it superficially, it might look as if a lot of it was going to developing countries. But that's really the wrong way to think about it. It was going from Europe to what were at the time called zones of recent settlement. Australia, Canada, the United States, Argentina, southern Brazil. Zones of recent settlement basically were places where white people were moving in, killing the locals, and building railroads. Then came World War I, and very small capital flows for a long period thereafter. Markus is moving the cursor. There's this large current account deficit during World War II because the United States was lending Britain the money to keep fighting the Nazis, but that was atypical. Basically, it was an era of capital controls, very limited private capital mobility. Flows were mostly, to the extent they took place, were mostly official, which lasted really until the 1970s when you started to get significant capital flows. The idea of trade being normally balanced is actually, there was a long period when it was, but it wasn't because you did not have government intervention was because you did. It was because of capital controls. And just, by the way, looking at the end, this doesn't get all the way up to the present, but Britain has run large current account deficits most years since 1980. And anyone who thinks that only America can run persistent current account deficits just hasn't looked at the rest of the world. Britain has done it. Australia has done it. It's basically any place that can attract lots of private capital has been able to run persistent current account deficits. There may be exorbitant privilege associated with the dollar. We certainly get a large zero-interest loan from all those $100 bills being held by drug lords in South America and so on. And it's possible, although it's extremely difficult to tease out the data, that we can borrow somewhat more cheaply because of the international role of the dollar. But it's not at all clear that we certainly are not unique in the ability to run substantial current account deficits over long periods of time. So the next slide is one of my favorite in all of international macroeconomics. It's a chart of how mobile was capital over the very long run, going back to 1860. And it's from Alan Taylor and Maury Opsfeld, from their handbook chapter, and it has the best source I've ever read, namely introspection. This is based upon, there's lots of data, it's very scrappy, but their sense is that capital was highly mobile on the eve of World War I, became very immobile for a long time, largely because of government restrictions. By 2000, was back to something like where it is, like where it was before World War I. Once again, I mean, we actually did have some capital flows to developing countries, although those by and large have not gone too well. We did have a Latin American debt crisis in the 80s and an Asian debt crisis at the end of the 90s. But lots of flows, the United States attracting a lot of capital from the rest of the world. Let's do the next slide, which is, this is actually net exports, so not current accounts. So it's even a little bit closer to, this is basically the trade balance as a share of GDP for the United States. The U.S., there's that immediate post-World War II period of Marshall Plan and all of that when we ran big surpluses. Then roughly balanced trade for a long time, turning into major trade deficits in the 1980s. And a brief period of almost return to balance, then even bigger trade deficits thereafter. Now, a lot of the literature of this sort of new thinking about trade balances starts from the proposition, or argues the proposition, that U.S. trade deficits reflect the role of the dollar as a reserve currency. That we are running trade surpluses trade deficits because we're basically forced to, because foreigners want dollars as reserve assets. And actually, it's a funny thing. That's a kind of a 1950s, 1960s view of the world. That is the way things used to work. I've even seen people start to reference the Triffin problem, because Robert Triffin famously worried about that in the 60s, also connected with the gold standard, which obviously didn't survive. It's not a very good description of most of the modern world anymore. Now we have capital flows, and lots of private capital flows generally dominate official capital flows. Capital flows generated by the demand for the dollar as a reserve asset are certainly part of the story, but not most of the story. The one thing I will say is that kind of 50s, 60s world of extensive capital controls and very limited private movements of capital does not describe most of the world anymore. But one place it does describe is China, which does maintain capital controls. And the Chinese current account balance is much more a kind of this state decision than any place else. And since China is a significant part of the world, you don't want to just dismiss this. And in some sense, if China decides to run a trade surplus, which it basically does because China has inadequate domestic demand, they have an absurdly high investment share of GDP, a collapsing housing bubble, extremely high domestic savings rate, and are weirdly unwilling to redistribute income to consumers and rebalance the economy. So they do seek trade surpluses as a safety valve, and somebody has to run a counterpart trade deficit. Now, it doesn't have to be entirely the United States, and the fact that it sort of is telling you that it's not just about China needs surpluses. And I don't buy the story that that's because the dollar is the reserve asset. Maybe we'll have some questions about that. But it's even if the Chinese insisted on buying dollars, there's lots of other capital movements in the world, and it could be offset by capital outflows from the United States if that's what people wanted to do. So I don't buy that story. One thing that I think is really important.
Does it always come with an exchange rate distortion? So if the Chinese buy a lot of US treasuries, it pushes up the dollar relative to the Chinese currency, but also potentially relative to the euro.
It's not clear why it should push up the dollar relative to the euro. Why, if China decides to run a trade surplus, why doesn't that push up everybody against the renminbi? Why does it have to be the dollar? Again, yes, maybe the Chinese are buying dollars, but there are private capital flows. If the dollar looks overvalued relative to the euro, money can move from America to Europe. Now, that's obviously sort of not happening, but the reason, and that kind of ties in with my next slide, which is kind of, why is this not happening? And the answer is capital is flowing to the United States because the U.S. has done so well technologically. So that we had a nearly balanced trade account in circa 1990, which then became a big deficit by the end of the 1990s. That is really associated with rapid productivity growth in the United States. That was the era in which the United States kind of had figured out what to do with IT, and the rest of the world had not. Europe in particular lagged behind. And even despite the fact that there's now internet everywhere, the productivity gap between the U.S. and Europe really widened out from about 1995 onwards. The recent Draghi report is essentially a hair on fire report on Europe's productivity lag. If you take a look at the next slide, which I think is in some ways a little bit better, if we can get to, so this is the BLS estimate of total factor productivity growth, which is a little bit less cyclical. The BLS numbers, I won't go back to them, but the BLS numbers measure from business cycle peak to business cycle peak, which is a good procedure. I don't know if anybody saw it, but I'm calling that the Anna Karenina principle. All happy economies are alike. Each unhappy economy is unhappy in its own way. So business cycle peaks are a lot more similar than business cycle troughs. But it kind of, I think, misses the timing. So this is and TFP is less cyclically sensitive. And these are 10-year rates of growth. So that peak you see in 2005 is saying that we had rapid total factor productivity growth from 1995 to 2005. Really not quite as high as what we achieved during the post-war boom, but still quite a lot higher than before or since, which we think, TFP is always it's the measure of our ignorance. It's the residual. It's what we can't explain with measurable factors, but we think that's basically information technology. It was U.S. firms figuring out what to do with it. A lot of it in interesting ways. I mean, there were really big gains in service productivity because of improved inventory management, which is probably not one of the glamorous things you thought we were going to do with the internet, but we did. But the important point is, if you were a naive, really crude international trade as a competition and trade surpluses mean that you win, you would say that this U.S. productivity boom must have led us to run big trade surpluses. In fact, it did the opposite. It made the U.S. an attractive investment destination, and so actually it caused us to run big trade deficits.
But can you
Yeah.
just in the 2000s, of course, TFP growth is very high, but also in the 60s and 70s, but the trade deficit was very different.
The trade deficit in the 60s and 70s was we had rapid productivity growth, but so did everybody else. One point there is that, which I can't show, is the U.S. was doing really well, but in some ways Europe was doing even better. These are the 30 glorious years after World War II for Europe. This is the period when we think of Italy as a sad case now, but during that post-war 30 years, Italy's per capita GDP doubled. So it wasn't the case that the U.S. we were actually growing a little bit more slowly, but that was catch-up growth in Europe. But what was distinctive about this period after 1995 is that the U.S. seemed to be getting big dividends from IT and other countries not. Somewhere in there, I think it's right at early on, that's when Jacques Chirac said the internet is an Anglo-Saxon network. Although that may have been a weak translation, it may have just meant an English language network. But still, there was this sense that America. Now, that particular thing is not true at all now. I mean,
but why is it important to compare TFP growth between Europe and US and not between China?
Well, China's I should have China there as well. China's actually an interesting story because if we believe the standard estimates, Chinese TFP, which grew very, very rapidly, as you might expect, in the 90s and much of the 2000s, has actually stagnated since. That probably reflects just massive misallocation of capital. It probably reflects all of those ghost towns.
Do you think it's mostly factor growth coming in? More people are employed, so there's factor growth rather than TFP.
Yeah, it's. There's raw labor productivity is still rising because they're capital deepening. China is investing 45% of GDP, and some of that is going into completely useless housing, but some of it is still going into capital deepening in factories and so on. But no, it's a really interesting question how China can have stagnated, as far as we can tell. As TFP is in some sense a science fiction, but how they can be still well behind, obviously, overall. They can do some really impressive things, like DeepSeek, but overall technological level is still clearly well below that of the West. How is it that they can be stagnating? I don't have any expertise in China, but it is a question.
The fact that the U.S. invested more in foreign direct investments and risky assets, productive assets, while the Chinese invested into some U.S. treasuries.
Well, in terms of the there was the U.S. has for a long time we had a positive balance on investment income, even though we were a net debtor nation, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that U.S. firms were holding direct investment abroad, while foreigners were holding safe assets. Although it turns out that probably another significant factor was simple tax avoidance. That a lot of the profits that foreign firms were in fact earning in the United States, or U.S. firms, whatever, a lot of profits being earned in the United States were somehow showing up in Ireland. So the leprechaun economics has probably distorted those numbers. Actually, one of those, these questions, particularly tax avoidance, for anyone who doesn't know, there's a big difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax evasion is illegal and you can get sent to jail. Tax avoidance may be despicable, but it is legal. And mostly what we see is tax avoidance. If people don't know this, there was one year when Irish GDP grew 25%, and it really grew more like 4%. But what happened was that mostly Apple, we think, changed its tax avoidance strategy and relocated a lot of its profits to Ireland, causing measured GDP to jump. And off the cuff, I call that leprechaun economics, which for the most part the Irish have taken in good humor, although some government officials have not. But anyway, so there's a whole other question. It is also kind of interesting, sort of relevant to these things, that we had, to the naked eye, we had a lot of technological change after the late 2000s. The smartphones. I guess the first iPhone is 2006. The mobile internet is in there. There's a lot of changes, and of course a tremendous rise in the capitalization of tech companies. But if we believe the economic numbers, the payoff is really pretty hard to see. It kind of looks like the 70s when I think Bob Solow said that you can see the computer everywhere except in the numbers. And
But do you think the mismeasurement was higher in the 2000s than earlier
That's
decades?
always a question. That we clearly mismeasure. We clearly understate economic growth. That there are benefits to technological progress that we don't know how to count. But to some extent, that's always been true. And so if we were going to look at, I did for some entirely different purposes, but since we now have a president who thinks that we were at our greatest under William McKinley, you should look at the death toll from infectious disease. Circa 1900 was about 20 times what it is now, and that doesn't show in GDP. And that's partially antibiotics and vaccines, but a lot of it is just plain public health and clean water. And so we've always undermeasured true economic growth, and it's not at all clear that it's more so now. Oh, and there are harms, by the way, also. I mean, just since we're digressing a bit, social media, cell phones probably cause a lot of unhappiness, and certainly seem to do a lot of damage to children. So in some ways we may be over measuring growth. Sorry, I'm definitely rambling here. I guess I'm allowed at my age. I'm doing a Trumpian weave here. This period when the U.S. has really outperformed European economies is also a period in which U.S. life expectancy has flatlined while continuing to rise. So, and presumably, we measure GDP, and I don't think that's wrong, but what we're ultimately interested in is quality of life, and sort of part of the quality of life is not being dead. And so the fact that there's something wrong in the fact that we are somehow failing to measure the fact that whatever it is that's going on in the United States is actually associated with really high mortality by the standards of other advanced countries.
So do you think demographics is a big component for the current account as well? That, if you have an aging society, you want to save up, partially abroad?
Yeah.
While if you don't have an aging society, you don't have this need to save so much.
It's possible, although this is a funny story because the U.S., if you look at the native-born U.S. population, it has low fertility, just like European countries do, and immigration has been a big altering factor. Since I don't know what time we are at now, but we've been going on for a while, so let me talk about the deindustrialization issue, which is, so this is a preoccupation, clearly a preoccupation with the current administration in the United States, but lots of people as well. And a lot of the complaint about trade imbalances is that it does contribute to deindustrialization. So Markus, you mentioned about China. China is vastly bigger as a manufacturing power than it is as an overall economic power. I'll talk in a second about why I don't think that necessarily China is, I mean, depending on what your question you're trying to answer, whether that's the right measure, but China is also a substantially poorer country, probably just has a smaller share of spending on services and more on manufacturing. So what I find is a really useful kind of model for the role of trade imbalances in deindustrialization. Oh, before I get there, let me just say, manufacturing is important for a bunch of stuff. Among other things, we really worry now, and the world looks like a much more dangerous place than it did 3 years ago. We actually, we're all looking at Ukraine, and we're actually thinking about what happens if we have a conflict over Taiwan, and manufacturing capacity could matter a lot there. But also, there's a widespread view that manufacturing is where the good jobs are, which used to be true. But it's not especially true anymore in the United States. If you do hourly wages are slightly lower for non-supervisory workers in manufacturing than they are in the rest of the private sector. Now, if you do some demographic adjustments, there is still some manufacturing premium, but it's not remotely what people imagine, that you could have a middle-class income if you worked in manufacturing and only if you worked in manufacturing. The reason the manufacturing used to be a good jobs sector was that it was where the unions were strong, and they've been mostly broken, and we haven't unionized the big service sector companies. So anyway, how much of the deindustrialization is because of trade imbalances? And so my next slide is what I think is a more interesting comparison or more relevant than China, which is Germany. Because Germany is also an advanced country, so in some ways more comparable to the United States. The German data start in 1991 because Germany as a unified country starts in 1991. Germany has a smaller industrial sector than it used to. And if we could extend that series back, it would probably be even higher. And it's substantially smaller as a share of GDP than the US was in the 60s, but substantially larger than the United States. The reason, presumably, is that Germany is a big trade surplus country, and especially a big manufacturing trade surplus country. So it's not simply that Germany runs large current account surpluses where the United States runs large current account deficits, but also Germany doesn't have large agricultural exports. It's heavily dependent on energy imports, whereas the United States is essentially energy self-sufficient. So all of that translates into a really big German manufacturing trade surplus. It's actually startlingly hard to get those numbers, but I think I've got them. In 2023, Germany ran a manufacturing trade surplus of a little over 8% of GDP. The United States ran a manufacturing trade deficit of a little over 4% of GDP. So that's kind of a 13-point of GDP difference. And the next slide shows the impact on the size of the manufacturing sector. And the German manufacturing sector as a share of GDP is about 8 points higher than in the United States. Now you might ask, if the trade balance is 13 points, why is the manufacturing sector only 8 points? And the answer is, if you spent $1 on manufactured goods, a fair bit of that leaks out into purchases of service inputs by manufacturing firms. So $1 of manufactured goods sold, exported, translates into something like 60 cents of manufacturing value added. So it ends up being a smaller, but still substantial. Clearly, Germany is more of a manufacturing nation than the United States because of those large trade surpluses. Now, whether again, manufacturing jobs are not necessarily good jobs, and Germany has not German GDP currently is just about what it was just before COVID, whereas U.S. is about 10% higher. So Germany, now that's a little bit of that is demographics, but mostly it's just that, big trade surpluses and a strong manufacturing sector by no means guarantee economic success.
I mean, Germany might have also sold off a lot of this technology, this manufacturing technology, to China.
Well, yeah.
This is only a temporary. It doesn't work in the long run.
Yeah, well, Germany clearly made German business and political system made some immense misjudgments. Heavy reliance on basically sales of internal combustion cars to China, which does not look like a good bet. Heavy reliance on cheap natural gas from Russia, which has turned out to be a really bad bet. But actually, my take, and I don't know about your feeling about this, but modern advanced economies, big ones, and Germany is a big modern advanced economy, they're much more diversified than you think. Despite all, it's very conspicuous, the auto industry. You think of Germany as the auto industry, and you think of Germany as dependent on those energy imports. But there's a lot more diversification and a lot more flexibility. 2.5 years ago, there was a whole literature on how crippling will a cutoff of natural gas be to the German economy. And it certainly hurt. But, grass isn't growing in the streets of Frankfurt. It turns out that Germany did a lot of adjustment. And I think people overstate the importance of those big sort of industrial global strategy mistakes, although they were big, and understate the extent to which Germany is suffering from weak productivity growth, poor demography, and really surprising low investment in infrastructure. It is actually, I don't know how often, but I've been struck, having gone on and off, but not too often. I've been struck that at the increasing feeling of shabbiness of German infrastructure, and I would just write that off as personal impressions are no substitute for data, but the data also say that Germany has really underinvested in infrastructure. And I wrote the other day about my bad experiences at Frankfurt Airport and got a lot of pushback from people saying, no, it's great, but that has not been my experience anyway. Okay. So last part, and then maybe we can have some discussion. Does all of this make a case for tariffs? Do these trade imbalances make a case for tariffs? And that's kind of where a lot of this discussion is going. So the part of the, why would you say there's a case for tariffs? Well, if you believe that trade deficits driven by government policies in surplus countries are a major source of deindustrialization, and deindustrialization is bad, then you might be willing to make a case for tariffs to limit that damage, which is kind of where this has been going in terms of its role in the policy debate. There are a couple of problems with that. One is that it's not at all clear that tariffs are a very effective way of, first, it's not entirely clear that size of the manufacturing sector per se ought to be a policy objective. Strength in strategically important industries is a different thing. And there's definitely, I believe it's Article 22 of the GATT, which basically says, forget everything else we said here if your national security is at stake. I always thought that was irrelevant, and after Ukraine, it does not look irrelevant at all. But that's really a case for subsidies to strategic industries. If you can but even to the extent that you do want to have a bigger manufacturing sector, do tariffs do that? So there's two things we think we know about tariffs. One is that they do tend to lead to retaliation. That if the United States sometimes tends to think that it's the only active agent in the world, but we're not, and we will face retaliation. We did a fair bit during the really quite small gauge tariffs during Trump 1, and so that happens. And then secondly, there's every reason to believe that a tariff will lead to a stronger dollar, which, again, current account plus capital account equals 0. Capital account, unclear what you're doing here, but if you squeeze, it's kind of like squeezing on a balloon. If you push down imports, then to reduce the deficit, then the deficit will probably tend to expand in other ways, and a stronger dollar will cut into your exports. And as you can see, it's not quite as dramatic as you might think, but as the prospects of Trump tariffs have grown, the dollar has strengthened substantially. Sometimes people say, well, a tariff and a devaluation are equivalent, but they're not, because a devaluation expands both contracts imports and expands exports because it makes you more competitive. A tariff reduces imports, but it also reduces exports through the exchange rate channel. And at some, there's the Lerner symmetry theorem, which says that ultimately an import tax is the same as an export tax. And that's a little more complicated in a world of unbalanced trade, but it's still got a lot of truth to it. So this is not obviously a case for tariffs. Now, if you thought that the cause of trade imbalances was interventionist policy by the surplus countries, if you thought that the Chinese are engineering a trade surplus, which they are, but that they are the principal cause of the U.S. trade deficit, which I don't think is right. Tariffs as a tool to, basically as a threat to get people to change those policies, is certainly, it's not an irrational tool, and it's happened. Doug Irwin, our premier historian of trade policy, points out that that's exactly what Nixon did. The way Bretton Woods ended was that Nixon slapped on tariffs on everybody, saying, I'm keeping these tariffs on until you revalue your currencies against the dollar, which he did, and they did, and Bretton Woods ended and was replaced by the Smithsonian Agreement, which died in less than a year and a half and gave rise to floating rates. But anyway.
So can you quantify, say, on the one hand, tariffs, are bad, but the dollar movement then actually mitigates that? Would you say it would undo it? To what percentage? Would you say half or fully?
Yeah, Kim Clausing and colleagues have been doing this at Peterson, and I don't have their numbers right in front of me, but I believe that if we're thinking about the impact on consumer prices, U.S. tariffs absent retaliation would lead to a rise in the dollar that might cut the impact on consumer prices roughly in half. And the micro studies that say that essentially all of the Trump 1 tariffs, were passed on to consumers, are probably correct but misleading, because this is a general equilibrium effect, and those are partial equilibrium analyses. However, there will be retaliation, and probably a lot more than Trump et al. Realize. Particularly the case of Canada. So Canada runs a large bilateral surplus with the United States, which suggests that the U.S. would have the upper hand in any kind of tariff war, except that more than all of that bilateral surplus is Canadian oil exports. to the upper Midwest, and which the United States probably doesn't actually want to tariff. In fact, if anything, the Canadians might use an export tax to put pressure on us. And if you look at the rest, if you look at manufacturing, it's actually, if anything, a small U.S. surplus. So there could be retaliation. So a lot hinges on what other governments do, and it's probably a really bad idea to assume that they will be just sit there passively. And old line, Richard Cooper, so history of international macro thought, he used to say that the danger if the United States goes protectionist is not so much retaliation as emulation. That if we start doing that, so does everybody else, and that, among other things, means that the offset to consumer prices from a stronger dollar becomes substantially weaker than you might have expected. So anyway, I think it's good that we're thinking about these things and rethinking about it, and not just saying, free trade is good, free capital movement is good. But I think that a lot of the discussion going on now is wrong-headed, but starting point for discussion.
Do you think there will be a big shift between large countries and small countries? So because large countries essentially can get their way around it, while small countries, if there are tariffs all over the place, it will be a big problem. The biggest losers will be small countries. Do you agree with that?
I do worry about that. It's I'm not sure that big countries can get their way around it, but they're not as dependent on international trade. They have bargaining power simply because of their size. Now, large countries, in this case, should include the EU. Because although the Europeans are not very good at acting in unity on lots of things, trade policy is set in Brussels for the whole region. So there are basically three Goliaths in world trade, which is U.S., China, and the EU. And all of them have the capacity to stand up for themselves, retaliate. It's an interesting question if we're talking about U.S. versus Canada or U.S. versus Mexico. On the one hand, the U.S. is enormously bigger. On the other hand, we're actually really surprisingly dependent upon an integrated manufacturing sector, and there's a lot of damage that can be done. But I worry a lot about smaller, poorer countries. When people ask me, where are the benefits of globalization, my sort of case in point tends to be Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. I'm old enough to remember when everyone was expecting Malthusian crisis and mass starvation in Bangladesh. And it's still a very poor country, but it's about 3 times as rich as it was then. And it's all based around exports of labor-intensive goods, basically apparel.
But there's also the argument that China is dominating the manufacturing sector so much that other developing countries, they cannot really do the same thing as China did in the last 20, 30 years.
No, that's a real question.
Yes.
And I have mixed feelings, I'm not mixed feelings, I am quite confused about whether others can emulate the Chinese experience. Now, although it's funny, what we used to say, going back far enough, when you had the original growth of the newly industrializing economies of East Asia, we said, well, that's fine. South Korea and Taiwan can have booming manufacturers' exports, but there has to be a limit to the potential market for that stuff. What would happen if China tried to do the same thing? And they did, and somehow or other, the world found room for those Chinese exports. Now, I think that was a lot of that had to do with the rise of global value chains, with the fact that suddenly the range of things that you being able to break up manufacturing process into many stages and put the labor-intensive parts around the world, that vastly expanded the range of possibilities. But we don't know. But I do worry just a lot that, I mean, what happens to Vietnam? I mean, Vietnam has been another surprising success story, but it's also, without question, to some extent, a kind of conduit for Chinese production. That it's kind of a way around the U.S. Tariffs to send Chinese goods to Vietnam, do a little bit to them, and then send them on. And so, are we going to be imposing tariffs? Well, Trump, the numbers keep changing, but if the U.S. really is going to impose 25% tariffs across the board on everybody, that's a huge burden. I mean, the Chinese will manage. The Canadians and the Mexicans can probably cause us enough pain that we back down. But what about Vietnam? What about Bangladesh?
So you're worried about smaller emerging economies. What about small advanced economies like Singapore? Will they suffer a lot too, or do you think they will find some?
That's a really interesting question. Or South Korea, for that matter.
South Korea, yes.
Even during the Biden years, I would go to South Korea, and Biden followed the IRA and the CHIPS Act. Both were quite nationalistic. Quite strong national preferences and Buy American aspects, which were, necessary parts of the politics. And the South Koreans would say, "Aren't you guys violating? We have a free trade agreement with America. Aren't you violating that agreement?" To which the answer was, "Well, yeah. In terms of the IRA, I think that saving the planet takes priority, and this is the only way we could get this thing done. But it was a real thing." So yeah, the small advanced countries that aren't in the EU, and then the interesting question. Well, I think Britain will be able to make a deal, but basically, European countries will be fine. Interesting question. What about Australia? You would think, hey, they're our friends. They speak English. Surely we won't be punishing them, but I don't think that's at all clear under the current regime.
Can I come back to increasing returns to scale? So
Yeah.
would you agree with this hypothesis that increasing returns to scale become more and more prominent over time? Or you think that's too much? And if we live in a world where there's increasing returns to scale, then industrial policy becomes more and more prominent as well. And are there tensions on the trade side on this, or how do you see it?
It's an interesting. It's complicated. Increasing returns actually expand the gains from trade, because by being able to concentrate industries, you get more scale economies. And on the other hand, there's always the question of who gets the increasing returns sector, a significant U.S. productivity advantage over Europe looks significantly smaller, not most of it, but significantly smaller if you exclude Silicon Valley and a couple of other tech hubs, which are just extremely high productivity. And is that a story about the United States, really, or is it simply that giving increasing returns, there has to be a Silicon Valley somewhere in the world, and for historical reasons it happens to be in California. There's always been this question, should you have policies trying to make sure that the good stuff is, that you get the good stuff, and then, on the other hand, if everybody's trying that, doesn't it end up fragmenting markets and dissipating the gains from increasing returns? And then there's a further question, which I'm still trying to work out, which is actually how much of that Silicon Valley productivity bump for the United States actually accrues to the benefit of the United States.
As opposed to the customers at the global scale, or?
Well, customers, but also to, is it just a handful of,
Okay.
are we basically just enriching Mark Zuckerberg and not the rest of us? Or are we just enriching, about 40% of equity in U.S. firms is owned by residents of other countries? It's one of those big questions when we're talking about the Trump tax cut, that if you wanted to do any kind of welfare analysis for the United States, you needed to take into account that something like 40% of the benefits to corporations were actually not accruing to U.S. nationals. So it's a little bit confusing, but I will say that if you combine the increasing returns issues with the sudden salience of strategic issues, then actually the case for industrial policy to make sure that you have critical mass in some sectors is pretty big. And arguably that's what Biden and all were trying to do. How much it was succeeding, it's not clear. And then with Trump, as far as we can make out now, it's not strategic at all. It's just we want everything made in America.
But would you agree or do you think that in the 70s or 80s, increasing returns to scale was there, but it is now more pronounced with the newest technologies compared to the older technologies? Or do you think that's...
I'm not at all sure about that. It's... I mean, it may be, but it may be that first of all, you want to distinguish between internal and external economies of scale. And internal economies of scale are probably less important than they used to be, although not entirely. Though it's still always a little bit, shocking. High precision chip manufacturing equipment is basically, that's an internal economies of scale, and it all comes from that dangerous imperialist power of the Netherlands. But in general, the sort of importance of big factories is probably smaller than it was. External economies, it's probably true that they were always big and subtler than not necessarily in industries that you think of. So the original Alfred Marshall discussion of agglomeration economies was inspired by the cutlery industry of Sheffield. It wasn't, and the United States used to have these industrial clusters all over the place, but Silicon Valley is really huge. Actually, the two places where there are really conspicuous external economies that also appear to lead to very high value added per worker are technology and finance. Mm-hmm. So there's really, there's Silicon Valley and to a lesser extent Seattle, and then there's New York and London. And those are the places which really generate a huge amount of value, clearly because of the circular logic of external economies. Whether we can see, probably, certainly the example of Silicon Valley is there has never been anything quite like that in the history of the world before. Although arguably, Manchester in the mid-19th century might have been like that. And then there's lots and lots. One of the things that you discover about China is that overall, China's export pattern probably mostly reflects comparative advantage, although there may be increasing returns elements as well. But there are a lot of industrial clusters in China. So while they may have a sort of comparative advantage in sort of medium tech goods at this point, they also have the advantage that comes from having a particular Guangzhou is this huge agglomeration that clearly benefits from external. Actually, I guess I should just say the Pearl River Delta, that whole thing, which is 80 million, at least 80 million people. But also small. There's an underwear city that produces a lot of the world's underwear, that sort of thing. So, but it was never true. If you think, this is a little bit like believing that there was once upon a time when trade was naturally balanced. And that hasn't been true since the mid-19th century. And if you think there was once a world in which increasing returns were not an important issue, well, that's also, read the special bulletin on manufacturers from the 1910 U.S. Census, and you'll discover that increasing returns have been an important issue for a long time.
So coming back, so let's suppose increasing returns to scale become more prominent, and also small countries, have a disadvantage. Do you expect that smaller countries try to join some trading blocs, or do you expect that some will join the European Union or Mercosur, or they make outside of the United States, there will be more people joining new blocs, or do you think this is less likely?
I think it's quite likely. Now you can have full increasing returns in a small country by having that small country heavily specialize in one thing.
Yes.
So ASML, something like that.
It's very risky or not very resilient.
What? Well, it's fine if you are part of a trading bloc.
Yes.
And that's so. Yeah, I would say that I would say that Britain should really, really seriously consider. I know that they're not ready to reverse Brexit, but forging at least amicable, enduring trading relations with the EU is going to be really important, because firms are going to want guaranteed access to that market. Now, the other thing, of course, is that when is an agreement an agreement? And that's the big question that's raised now by Trump and his threats against Canada and Mexico. A lot of investment was undertaken on the basis that NAFTA meant that we would never again have to worry about tariffs in North America, and suddenly we do. But yeah, I would imagine that if you are now the Europeans, I think are setting up. They're making it easier for countries, on their periphery that are not full EU members to create something that at least is a reasonable approximation. If the United States gets past this moment, but knowing that these things can happen. If I were the government of, I guess we actually have we have Dr. CAFTA, Dominican Republic, Central American Free Trade Area, but I would say, really strengthen that. And if I were one of those countries, I'd say, let's really do that. There are, it's a fascinating world.
Smaller countries have to decide themselves to join one bloc or the other, or they can dance between the blocs, or what would you do?
30 years ago, there was a lot of talk about the world sort of breaking up into separate trading blocs, and which turned out to be premature. Didn't really happen. But now maybe it does. And yeah, you probably have to. it's going to be a very unhappy situation for, say, Argentina or Brazil, which are sort of, well, they're roughly equidistant from the U.S. and from the EU, and actually also a lot of ties with China. And if they have to pick a side, that's going to be an extremely painful process. Yeah, it's there's going to be plenty to write about.
Let me raise one last issue, and one is, we talked a lot about manufacturing, but do you expect international trade will be much more about services down the road?
That's one thing which I think is really fascinating.
And can you put tariffs on services, or that's technically impossible?
You can. I mean, it's a tariff is fundamentally a sales tax, and it requires different kind of administration. You can't charge the thing at the at the port because there's no port, but you could certainly impose a tax on purchases of services from overseas. But that's an interesting story because I don't know before your time at Princeton, but Alan Blinder, issued some dire warnings about outsourcing of services in the mid-2000s, which turned out to have been way premature. And now there's a really interesting. There's actually a competition between AI and outsourcing. Right? If you call a service number for answers, you might get somebody in Bangalore or Manila, or you might get an AI. And so, in some ways, AI is a substitute for globalization. Something like that has been true for a while. And by the way, the long history. We tend to think that globalization always rises unless stopped by protectionism. But actually, globalization represents a race between the technology of transportation and the technology of production. And it's only because, on average, over the centuries, transportation technology has progressed faster than production technology that the world has become more integrated. But it's not all clear. The interwar period, it may actually have gone the other way. It wasn't just protectionism that caused trade to stagnate then. And right now, I think there's a real issue of technology making outsourcing of services actually less attractive, less necessary.
So if you look at India, for example, then they're very much threatened by the AI revolution.
No, that's right.
Would you say, well, let's focus on manufacturing like the Chinese, but the door is a little bit closed too because the Chinese dominate that. So on services, you're threatened by AI. So
I don't have an answer for what India should do there. I haven't thought about it, but even this, we're saying, hey, it's great you can send your X-rays to over the internet to an analyst in India who can diagnose for a fraction of the cost. But you can also put your X-rays through not an LLM, but whatever the visual equivalent is, and that may be more attractive. It certainly reduces the incentive to outsource. And India. India is another, not the same way as the Germans did, but in some ways India may have made a bad bet by relying upon the outsourcing of services in a world where technology is making that less necessary. I'm looking at my screen here, by the way, for everybody watching. I could have moved that bottle of gin that you can see over my shoulder out of the way, but I left it there just in honor of our new Secretary of Defense. Anyway, sorry.
Okay, so let me just come back to this one question. So if you have two countries, and because of increasing returns to scale, one country is really strategically using industrial policy, what do you think is the best response then for the second country? Should it also react with industrial policy in order to attract some of these industries, or should it use tariffs? Or is our tariffs justified in that case? Or what are the third alternatives?
Okay. I think that the old standard economic analysis, all the way back to Max Gordon, and there may be somebody in your audience who actually read the 50-year-old book, Trade Policy and Economic Welfare. Policies, even when there are market failures, policies should always be as surgical as possible. They should be aimed at what it is you're trying to do. So if your goal is to promote manufacturing of certain goods, then subsidize manufacturing. A tariff is just a subsidy plus a sales tax. And why are you doing that? Why add the extra distortion? In fact, if you're specifically trying to promote technology, you should be subsidizing the technology as directly as possible. But tariffs are the basic lesson, a long tradition of international economics. A lot of international economic policy literature over the generations was taking seriously, for developing countries, issues of increasing returns, spillovers, external economies, learning, were always very much on people's minds, because it was, how does a less developed country become developed? But the conclusion of most of the analysis was that tariffs are almost never the right answer. Anything that would justify a tariff is an even better justification for some kind of subsidy. So I think, and the thing is, the world of subsidy wars is a lot more benign in a lot of ways than a world of tariff wars. And in particular, it is at least somewhat more benign for smaller countries that might get caught in the crossfire.
Good. Thanks a lot, Paul. We leave it at that. I think there are thousands of other topics we can talk about, but I think we're way over time.
It's what a crazy. I'll just say, I got into international economics. Basically 1973, 74. We just had Bretton Woods collapse and the first oil shock, and I thought, boy, these are such times. The world will never be this crazy again. And it has just kept getting crazier over the past 50 years.
It will keep you busy,
so
and it makes it worthwhile writing and analyzing.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to everybody for joining us, and hope to see you soon again.
Okay, good luck.
Bye-bye. Thank you.